In the face of unprecedented changes not seen in a century, what can you do? Of course, you need to make arrangements and efforts to hedge against risks. That depends on what you actually do, not on how much you have figured out or understood. Because when discussing such issues nowadays, there are basically two underlying assumptions. First, when discussing these geopolitical issues, or China's position in future development trends in the global economy, there are basically just these two categories. Personally, I think being optimistic or pessimistic is useless. Optimists move forward, pessimists are correct, but only the wise can win in future competition. Because all human behavior ultimately boils down to either rationality or emotion, but both can be analyzed. How should I put it? There really is nothing new under the sun. Human behavior can be predicted. By studying history, we gain clarity of purpose. Looking at the past allows us to foresee the future. It is indeed predictable. This even includes large language models like ChatGPT, which can replace many people's jobs, because as humans, we must first admit that we are a flawed compound, a flawed species. That's why we often act irrationally, and the consequences of such irrationality are often disastrous. History keeps repeating itself. World War I, World War II. This includes the Cold War, the rise and fall of various dynasties throughout history, and different social movements. All of these illustrate this point. Now, reform has entered deep waters. After humanity entered the internet era, a major issue emerged. People around the world can basically access information equally. This right is fundamentally granted and protected. Cases of information asymmetry have become rare under these circumstances. Secondly, even if information asymmetry leads to a misallocation of resources, it could eventually cause problems. However, I believe that society as a whole tends to return to a virtuous path, and such issues will be quickly corrected. The mechanisms for correcting these errors are stronger than they were in the past. Thirdly, I personally think there will be a kind of return to virtue, but I don't think you should try to precisely analyze when exactly certain things will happen in the future, whether it's due to ideology, international competition, geopolitical factors, or industrial conflicts, among others, including new international trade, economic, or financial orders. I believe such analyses are endless, and you may never arrive at a definitive answer. So what can you do with certainty? Personally, I think that in such an environment, in the midst of unprecedented changes not seen in a century, what can you actually do? Of course, you need to make arrangements and efforts to hedge against risks, and that depends on what you do, not on how much you have figured out or understood. So, this is an era that requires a plan B, a time when you need alternative solutions. I believe that how you view things is less important than what actions you take. The second point is that having a plan B is very important. As for implementing Plan B, I think it's always better to do it than not, and it's better to act more and talk less. Taking action is better than doing nothing. Third, by taking action, all you're really doing is making some changes to your personal life trajectory, your personal balance sheet, and your family's balance sheet. In fact, nothing else has changed. It might just mean that what you were supposed to do in the future, you were simply doing ahead of time today. I actually think that turning a bad situation into a good one means we now have to consider things that we might have only thought about 10 or 20 years from now. But today, we have to face them. So, what is the third question? That is, we really need to think about what exactly has caused something we thought was unlikely to happen to actually occur. We need to determine whether these issues are systemic in nature or just occasional phenomena. But what if it's just a phenomenon? Then we might be able to manage it, because phenomena can be eliminated. However, if it's a systemic issue, if it's a mechanism, changing that mechanism is usually very difficult and takes a lot of time. So, such change won't come easily. In other words, to put it in terms we can all understand, reform has entered deep waters.